Hey guys, Paul here from Meldrum Performance Coaching again. So today we're going to be talking about a really interesting topic, well, I find, as it's really big in the rehab space and the pain management space, which is a really important space to be aware of. So there's been a bit of a dichotomy between what's happening with treatment of movement-related disorders. On one side of the fence, you have the biomechanical model people where all pain has a cause, there's a biomechanical explanation for pretty much all pain, and we need to address it biomechanically. On the flip side of that, you have the biopsychosocial people who say that the human body is incredibly resilient, they're right, and that pain is not just biomechanics, it involves psychology and sociology. Again, they're absolutely right. What we need to do though is kind of bridge the disconnect between the two, because a lot of people are just saying that it's either one or the other. So you got one side and the extremists on one side. So there's always extremists saying that, this is on the this mirrors me. This is on the biomechanical side, that we don't have to worry about the psychology of the patient. We just need to get them doing their exercises and moving better. And then one side they're saying it doesn't really matter how we move, the body's resilient, we don't need to worry about optimal form, etc. It's just all a matter of load management. And then we have to deal with the person and build up their self-efficacy in exercise, etc., etc. Now, what would probably be the best excuse, and the one that I use in my opinion, which is when I use my practice, so I wanted to share this with everyone, is kind of like what it's truly meant to be, which is a combination of the two. So when we're looking at a client who's come to us in pain, the first thing we need to do is to look at some kind of biomechanical assessment, to rule out red flags as well. That's a really important thing to do. The first thing should be always to rule out a red flag. I had an experience with a client, I spoke about it in my book, who saw another practitioner for treatment who didn't rule out red flags. I said, go get a scan, etc., etc. And she ended up dying of cancer, which would have been ruled out or have been identified earlier if these red flags had been adhered to. Do I know if that would have prevented her from dying? Absolutely not. It was a long time ago as well, but it probably would have been a better case of doing the best practice. So with the biopsychosocial people, it's a lot of people talking about the load management is the most important thing. If someone gets injured during exercise, it's simply that they're not ready for the load. And I think load management is one part of the problem, and it's a pretty important part of the problem. So once we've identified that there's no red flags, we've done a biomechanical assessment, what we want to use the biomechanical assessment for is to identify what the load management issue is. So it's not just load management in terms of they're doing too much volume overall. We want to look a little bit more granular than that. We want to get a little bit more micro level rather than they're doing too much volume of leg training. It's more like when they're doing volume of leg training, where is the load being managed? So for a lot of particular scenarios, it's kind of like, all right, they're doing too much volume, let's back off and build them up slowly and build their range of motion, which would be called, I guess, exposure therapy, which is a totally valid and useful way to help someone rehab someone through an exercise and a movement pattern. What we need to do before that is we need to look at all the joints above and below and surrounding that structure that's experiencing pain and look at how they're managing load. And this is where the biomechanical assessments, neuromuscular movement assessments all come into play. So you see a lot of people ignoring these and discounting their validity and going, oh no, you just need to put your knees over toes, for example, or you just need to keep on squatting and you'll eventually feel better. That's not correct. It's not really useful. It doesn't really offer a solution to a problem besides wait it out and see. So what we need to do is start getting a little bit more skilled at looking at the joints and looking at the joints above and below. Like, so for example, knees. Knees are kind of like that joint where a lot of people get overuse injuries. They don't really get underuse injuries in their knees. It doesn't really happen. You don't really get underuse problems in your knees very often. You only see like weak quads in like high-level squatters, for example, who got a bad deadlift. But what we need to think about with the knee is the knee's kind of like a slave joint, because if the hip is not internally rotating, the knee has to compensate for that in certain ways. If the hip isn't going into full flexion, the knee has to compensate for that. If the ankle doesn't have multi-planar movement, so triplanar movement in the ankle joint, that movement's going to have to come from somewhere else, and that could be tibial torsion underneath the knee, so tibia and femoral mechanics. It could be just simple in the knee collapsing in, so going into increased valgus, which is going to put strain on the medial ligaments and meniscus and other structures. So what we really need to do is take a more in-depth approach. So now I'm going to talk about what my approach would be. So first of all, when someone comes in, with pain, if it's beyond our scope of practice, step A is refer out straight away to a good physiotherapist, doctor, etc. And the main reason for that is to identify the red flags, and if there's anything that's really hard to work with. I try not to get patients too freaked out over things, or clients, I deal with both. I try not to get people too freaked out about things like disc bulges and stuff like that, because when we look under an MRI, most people have some kind of structural degradation, so we don't need to stress too much about that, and we don't need to get people hyper vigilant about it. From there, once they're cleared for their red flags, or if, like, I know they're in a condition where the red flags are extremely unlikely, still not something I recommend most people do, is then we'll go into an orthopedic and a biomechanical neuromuscular assessment to see what the hell is going on with that person's movement. What's going on? What structures are working to the presupposed norms? What structures aren't? What's the kind of strength going on? What's their training volume? It's a very holistic approach at it. It's not just going, oh, you're just pure biomechanics, that's it. It's not going, oh, no, it's purely in your head, you just overload your body and you're really resilient, you need to deal with that. It's combining the two approaches there. So looking at giving them specific exercises for whatever they need to do, looking at it from a hierarchical perspective comes next. So what that means is it's starting to look at the body from a system of what's most important to keep us moving. And that's, we're always going to come back to breathing, diaphragm, rib cage, pelvic functions, neck functions, etc. So we want to make sure that they're pretty good. We don't need to worry about them being absolutely perfect, but we want to check them and we want to integrate them into the movement patterns that we need to do to take the load off the overloaded tissues to then bring it back into the tissues that need to express that load appropriately. Now, showing that on a podcast / videocast, it's doable, but on a podcast, it's next to impossible. But it would be, for example, someone's got glenohumeral joint pain, shoulder pain, yet that we see their scapula is fixated, it's not really moving, it's not upwardly rotating, it's not elevating, for example, which is very, very common now, because people keep on saying shoulders down and back, which is a poison that's been taken from powerlifting into real life movement. Not that powerlifting is a bad thing, sorry about that. What we need to do is say we're trying to drive scapular upward rotation and expansion of the rib cage. We need to breathe into the rib cage, expand as we provide exercises that will produce force into providing that scapular upward rotation, provided we don't aggravate the tissues of the shoulder. What we should see if someone's in a pain situation is that they should get pretty significant improvement over the first 4 weeks. Our red flag, which is our biopsychosocial red flag approach, is if someone's getting to the 4-week mark post-injury and they're getting very little improvement and they're still in pain. At that point, we need to be aware that they're going down the road of being a chronic pain case. And a chronic pain case is something that's very, very hard to get out of. I've dealt with a number of chronic pain cases in my career, and they're very challenging clients to work with because they're obviously going through a ton of stuff. And when you are in chronic pain, your body becomes habituated to more chronic pain. You get sensitization and guarding of the nervous system, a whole bunch of other stuff that goes on that makes you far more vigilant and far less resilient to perceived insults to the musculoskeletal system. That sounds really clever. So throughout the whole process, we're communicating to people using the framework of the biopsychosocial approach. I write about this in my book, The Ultimate Body Transformation Expert, which I don't have on hand. I write about that because the way we communicate with someone will help them deal with the situation throughout the whole way. So when a client comes to me, I assess them, I find out what's going on, I reassure them that the body is resilient, that they will get better. I still address their biomechanics and give them movements to drive what is important, always keeping in mind how the body works from a very survival-based level, because if we get those fundamentals right, everything else kind of turns on pretty good and pretty easily. And from there, then communicate that client throughout the process, make sure they're progressing, make sure they're feeling better, validate and answer all their concerns. So listen to all that, and then manage the rest of their load appropriately. To give an example of this approach in the real world, I just finished off with a client, I finished off his rehab process with a client yesterday. He came to me with spondylofasciitis at the L4-L5 level and back pain on a whole bunch of different exercises. So first thing we did, I had a look at his biomechanics, checked out his movements, etc. In terms of a table-based assessment, so quite basic, quite fundamental, just to see how the joints were all working, how his muscles were recruiting, had a look at his exercise program, had a look at his execution of a few different exercises. When he did his kettlebell swings, I noticed that he had a very extended lumbar spine in the end position of the exercise. From there, I also noticed in his prone hip extension mechanism, his erector spinae muscles fired up a lot quicker than his glutes with a lot more force. His glutes weren't really there, neither was his anterior core musculature and his ability to maintain a flat rib cage. And so what we did from there is I gave him a couple of different exercises addressing those biomechanical faults, modulated his training volume a little bit, checked on with him the next day, the day after that. Simple text message is enough in some cases. And when he came and saw me yesterday, he's like, yeah, my back's great. My pain's gone from like an 8 to like a 2 out of 10. This has absolutely transformed my quality of life. Pretty cool testimonial for a 30-minute treatment with no actual hands-on therapy, just some really guided exercise therapy, communication, load management. When he came in yesterday, I did a little bit more. I put him through some provocation tests to really test the extent of how far we could push him with his back, and found out that we had restored full movement to all the provocation tests. There was still some pain at the end range, but that was okay because he could now get to that end range. So what we can do is we can build that up over time. From here, we're building him now into a program where we're looking at, improving strength between the right and left side, more movement patterns, training all different weak links to make them a little bit stronger throughout the whole body. And then we're going to take him into a performance program for next year, which we're mapping out next week, where we're going to be looking at, doing 20K runs, a whole bunch of cool calisthenics skills, and lifting some heavy stuff off the ground while pursuing his goal as a pretty elite level climber. So that's an example of how powerful this model can be in essence, and it also gives all personal trainers or people working with clients like this something to do going forward. So once the client's going through their rehab stage, start looking at the performance stage, because rehab to performance are just basically two different ends of the same spectrum. So guys, that's my sort of moderately long-winded for me rant, or from the podcast anyway, long-winded rant about how to deal with load management in the exercise sector, how to integrate the biopsychosocial model of pain with the biomechanics model. I know bio is included in the biopsychosocial model, but a lot of people seem to discount it a little bit at the moment, which is, is what it is. Doesn't worry me too much. I still just want to do the best thing for my clients and the people that I work with and work to the best of my ability. And that's what I encourage you all to do as well. Thanks heaps for watching and listening, guys. Speak to you soon.